So in the colonial era, most American women of European descent lived lives much like those of their European counterparts. They were legally and socially subservient to men and trapped within a patriarchal structure. Lower and working class women were actually more equal to men of their own classes, but only because they were equally poor. As usual, it all comes back to economics. In general, throughout world history, the higher the social class, the greater the restrictions on women. Although high-class women have traditionally had the lowest mortality rates, which is one of the benefits of, doors and extra lifeboats and whatnot. So at least you get to enjoy that oppression for many years. But women did still improve their status via the ideology of Republican motherhood. Women were important to the new republic because they were raising children, especially male children, who would become the future voters, legislators, and honorary doctors of America. So women couldn't themselves participate in the political process, but they needed to be educated some because they were going to potty train those who would later participate in the political process. The cult of domesticity decreed that a woman's place was in the home. So rather than making stuff, the job of women was to enable their husbands to make stuff by providing food and a clean living space, but also by providing what our favorite historian Eric Foner called non-market values like love, friendship, and mutual obligation. The truth is, most American women had no chance to work for profit outside their houses, so many women found work outside traditional spheres in reform movements. Okay, let's go to the thought bubble. Reform movements were open to women partly because if women were supposed to be the moral center of the home, they could also claim to be the moral conscience of the nation. Thus, it didn't seem out of the ordinary for women to become active in the movement to build asylums for the mentally ill, for instance, as Dorothea Dix was, or to take the lead in sobering the men of America. Many women were also important contributors to the anti-slavery movement, although they tended to have more subordinate roles, like abolitionist Maria Stewart was the first African-American woman to lecture to mixed male and female audiences. Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote the terrible but very important Uncle Tom's Cabin. Sarah and Angela Grimke, daughters of a South Carolina slaveholder, converted to Quakerism and became outspoken critics of slavery. Sarah Grimke even published the Letters on the Equality of the Sexes in 1838, which is pretty much what the title suggests. In fact, one of the arguments used by pro-slavery forces was that equality under the law for male slaves might lead to a slippery slope ending with, equality for women. And out of this emerging consciousness of their own subordinate position, the movement for women's rights was born. The most visible manifestation of it was the issue of women's suffrage, raised most eloquently at the Seneca Falls Convention of 1848, where Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, and many others wrote and published the Declaration of Sentiments, modeled very closely on the Declaration of Independence. Except in some ways, this declaration was much more radical than the Declaration of Independence because it took on the entire patriarchal structure. Okay, so there are three things I want to quickly point out about the 19th century movement for women's rights. First, like abolitionism, it was an international movement. Often, American feminists traveled abroad to find allies, prefiguring the later transatlantic movement of other advocates for social justice like Florence Kelley and W.E.B. Du Bois. Secondly, for the most part, like other reform movements, the women's movement was primarily a middle-class or even upper-class effort. Most of the delegates at Seneca Falls, for instance, were from the middle class. There were no representatives of, cotton mills. But this didn't mean that 19th century feminists didn't acknowledge the needs of working women. Like Sojourner Truth, probably the most famous black woman abolitionist, spoke eloquently of the plight of working class women, especially slaves, since she'd been one until 1827. And other women recognized that women needed to be able to participate in the market economy to gain some economic freedom.